I tightened the last bolt under the sink, and the dripping finally stopped. When I looked up, she was crouched right beside me, close enough that I could smell fresh lemon from the bowl on her counter, and the afternoon light was falling straight through the window onto her cream-colored dress. She was looking at me strangely, like she had known my face for years, not just since that morning. "Are you always this kind?" she asked, her voice soft but somehow shaking underneath. I didn't know how to answer her, because I had no idea she was asking for a reason I hadn't even imagined yet. "My name is Nathan Cole, and I am 41 years old. For most of my adult life, I worked as a mechanical engineer at a company outside Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of place where I wore a badge on a lanyard and spent my days behind a desk arguing about specifications nobody outside the building would ever care about. 3 years ago, my marriage ended. There were no children involved, no custody battles, nothing to fight over except a house we had bought together and then quietly agreed neither of us wanted to keep. After the divorce, I did something that surprised almost everyone who knew me. I quit the desk job, sold my half of the equity I had built up, and moved 2 hours away to a small town where nobody knew my name or my history. I bought a modest house at the end of a quiet street lined with oak trees, the kind of place with a wraparound porch and a kitchen that still had the original 1950s cabinets. I told myself I was downsizing. The truth was closer to this. I wanted a life I could actually feel with my hands. So I started doing repair work for people in town, leaking faucets, sticking doors, sagging gutters, the small broken things that pile up in a person's life until they become background noise. I was good at it, better than I expected to be, and there was something deeply satisfying about ending a day with proof that I had fixed something real, instead of another meeting that led to another meeting. My mornings follow the same rhythm now, and I have come to depend on that rhythm the way some people depend on prayer. I wake before 6, make coffee black, no sugar, and drink it standing at the kitchen window watching the light come up over the yard. There are usually a few birds arguing in the maple tree by the fence, and some mornings I just stand there longer than I need to, listening to them, in no hurry to start anything. My toolbox sits by the back door, always packed the same way, and at the very top, wrapped in an old cloth, is a wrench that belonged to my father. He gave it to me the year before he passed, told me a good tool outlives the man who owns it if you take care of it right. I have never used another one in its place, not once, not even when it would have been easier. I won't pretend the house is never quiet in a way that presses on me. Some evenings after the tools are put away and the light outside has gone gray, I notice how empty the rooms sound, how my own footsteps seem too loud on the hardwood. I made peace with that a long time ago, or at least I told myself I had. I used to think I would grow old in this house alone, fixing other people's sinks and doors, coming home to nothing louder than the hum of the refrigerator, and for a long stretch of time, that felt like enough. Not happiness exactly, but something steadier than happiness. A kind of quiet I had chosen for myself. That was the shape of my life on the afternoon. A moving truck pulled up in front of the house next door. It had been empty for months, ever since the older couple who lived there moved south to be closer to their grandchildren. I remember standing at my own window with a cup of coffee, watching 2 men carry boxes up the front steps, and feeling a small flicker of curiosity I didn't examine too closely. I told myself it was nothing. New neighbors came and went in a town like this. I had no reason to think this one would be any different. No reason at all to think that the woman stepping out of that car, adjusting a box against her hip, was about to walk into my life and rearrange every quiet thing I had built. I went back to my coffee. I went back to my morning. And if you had told me then how much that ordinary Tuesday afternoon was about to matter, I don't think I would have believed you. 3 days after the moving truck left, there was a knock on my door just after 5 in the evening. I opened it to find her standing there, hair pulled back, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, an apologetic look on her face that I would come to know very well over the following months. Her name was Elena Marsh. She told me the sink in her kitchen had started leaking sometime that afternoon, and she had no idea what she was doing, and someone at the hardware store mentioned that the man 2 houses down fixed things for people in town. I said I'd take a look. That was the whole beginning of it, as far as I understood at the time. A dripping pipe. A neighbor being neighborly. Her kitchen smelled like fresh lemons from a bowl on the counter, and the late sun was coming in gold through the window over the sink. I got down on the floor, opened the cabinet, and found the problem in under a minute. A loose connector that just needed tightening. Elena crouched beside me the whole time, watching my hands more closely than the situation really called for, and when I finally shut the water off and the dripping stopped, I looked up and caught her studying my face with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not curiosity exactly, something closer to recognition. "Are you always this kind?" she asked, and there was a strange, small tremor underneath the question, like it meant more to her than the words themselves suggested. I laughed it off, told her it was just a loose fitting, nothing worth thanking me for. I didn't think about the question again that night. I had no reason to, but Elena kept needing things. A cabinet door that stuck, a porch light that flickered no matter how many bulbs she replaced, a bookshelf that needed assembling because the instructions, in her words, seemed to have been written by someone who hated her personally. I came to expect the knock on my door 2 or 3 evenings a week, and I won't lie and tell you I minded. There was something easy about being around her, something that didn't require performance or small talk that led nowhere. She would hand me tools before I asked for them, the right size, the right type, like she had done this before, like she already knew the rhythm of how I worked. One evening, while I was rewiring the porch light, she disappeared into the kitchen and came back out with 2 mugs of coffee. She handed me mine, and it was black, no sugar, exactly the way I drink it every single morning of my life, and I had never once mentioned that to her. I looked at the mug, then at her, and asked, half joking, how she knew. She shrugged and said something about guessing, about me seeming like a black coffee kind of man, and it was a reasonable enough answer that I let it go. But it stayed with me, a small detail sitting in the back of my mind like a splinter too shallow to hurt, just deep enough to notice every time I moved a certain way. It happened again a few weeks later. We were sitting on her back steps after I had finished patching a section of her fence, both of us tired in the good way that comes from finishing something with your hands, and she asked me, out of nowhere, whether I missed engineering. I hadn't told her I used to be an engineer. I was certain of that. I replayed every conversation we'd had since she moved in, and there was no version of events where that detail had come up. When I pointed this out, gently, not accusing her of anything, just genuinely puzzled, she went quiet for a second longer than felt natural. Then she smiled and said her cousin worked in construction and had mentioned something about engineers moving into repair work sometimes, that it must have been a guess that landed right. I wanted to believe her. I did believe her, mostly, because the alternative didn't make sense yet, and because I liked her too much to go looking for reasons not to. That was the strange rhythm of those early weeks, warmth building steadily, evenings spent side by side fixing small broken things around her house, and underneath all of it, tiny threads I couldn't quite trace back to their source. She would reference a detail about my life I hadn't shared, catch herself, and smooth it over so quickly that I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole exchange. Almost. One night in early autumn, we sat together on my porch instead of hers, watching the sky go from orange to a deep bruised purple over the tree line. Her paint-stained fingers were wrapped around a mug of tea because she'd told me once that coffee kept her up too late, and somewhere down the street a radio was playing something soft and low, an old jazz record drifting out of an open window. She was quiet for a long time before she spoke. "Do you ever get scared of caring about someone too fast?" she asked, not looking at me, looking instead at the darkening yard. I laughed, told her no, that I didn't really let myself get attached quickly anymore, not since the divorce, that I had trained myself out of it the way you train yourself out of any habit that costs you something. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. I had started listening for her car in the driveway. I had started finding reasons to be in my own front yard around the time she usually came home from the school, where she taught art to a room full of restless kids. I had started looking forward to the knock on my door, in a way I hadn't let myself look forward to anything in 3 years. She didn't say much after that, just nodded slowly, like my answer had confirmed something she already suspected. We sat there until the porch light drew moths and the cold pushed us both inside, and I remember thinking, watching her walk back across the yard, that there was something about Elena Marsh I couldn't fully account for. Not suspicion, not yet, just an awareness that she knew me in ways she hadn't earned the ordinary way. It was more like she had arrived already knowing, and was simply waiting for me to catch up. There was a Saturday, maybe 6 weeks after she moved in, when I walked over to return a ladder and found her at her kitchen table with a sketchbook open, charcoal smudged across 2 fingers. I asked what she was working on, and she closed the book a little too quickly, said it was nothing, just something for a class she taught. I didn't push, but I noticed, in the half-second before she closed it, a shape on the page that looked less like a still life and more like the line of a man's shoulder bent over a toolbox. I told myself I was imagining things. Most of what I told myself in those weeks, I would later learn, was the comfortable kind of wrong. What I couldn't argue with was how easy it had become to be around her. Some Sunday afternoons I would find an excuse to be out front, trimming a hedge that didn't need trimming, and she would find an excuse to be out front too, and we would end up talking across the low fence for an hour without either of us admitting that was the plan all along. She had a way of listening that made ordinary stories feel worth telling, and I found myself talking more in those months than I had in the 3 years before them combined. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that whatever small mysteries came bundled with a woman who brought me coffee exactly the way I liked it, and remembered which wrench I preferred without being told, they were worth far more than they cost. I had spent 3 years building a life around the absence of surprises, and here was Elena, quietly, patiently, filling my evenings back up with something I hadn't realized I was missing. If there was a version of this story where I should have asked harder questions sooner, I wasn't living in it yet. I was only living in the part where her laugh carried through the wall between our 2 ordinary houses, and where I found myself smiling at my own reflection for no reason I could name. The car pulled into my driveway on a Thursday afternoon, and I knew the sound of that engine before I even looked up from the gutter I was clearing. Rachel, my ex-wife, stepping out in heels that had no business on a gravel driveway, sunglasses pushed up into hair that had been styled by someone other than her, wearing perfume strong enough to reach me 2 stories up on the ladder. I hadn't seen her in almost 2 years, not since the divorce was finalized and we split the last of what belonged to both of us. She didn't call ahead. She never had, even when we were married. "We need to talk," she said, before I had even climbed down, like no time at all had passed since the last conversation we'd had. I asked what about, and she waved a hand toward the house, toward the ladder, toward the whole quiet shape of the life I had built without her, as if all of it were somehow beneath the question she was about to ask. Her second marriage, it turned out, had fallen apart 6 months earlier, faster and messier than mine had, and she had apparently decided, in the wreckage of it, that reaching back toward me was worth a 2-hour drive. I told her there was nothing to talk about. I meant it too, in a way I hadn't been sure I would feel if this moment ever came. 3 years ago, seeing her again might have opened something raw in me. Standing there that afternoon, ladder in hand, I mostly just felt tired. The specific tiredness that comes from being reminded of a version of yourself you worked hard to leave behind. She walked past me anyway, into the yard, running her fingers along the porch railing I had rebuilt the year before, taking in the flower beds, the freshly painted shutters, the whole quiet order of the life I had made without her. "You've done well for yourself," she said, and it didn't sound like a compliment so much as an inventory, the kind of comment she used to make when she wanted me to feel small for wanting something simple. I had forgotten how exhausting it was to stand near her, how every sentence seemed to carry a second meaning underneath the first one, waiting to surface later when it would do the most damage. That was when Elena's car turned onto the street, coming back from the school where she taught, and Rachel's whole posture changed. She watched Elena pull into the driveway next door, watched her step out with a bag of groceries balanced on one hip, and something calculating moved across her face, the kind of look I remembered from years of arguments that always seemed to end with her finding my weakest point and pressing on it. "New girlfriend already?" Rachel asked, not bothering to lower her voice. And Elena, who couldn't have missed it, kept walking toward her own front door with her eyes fixed carefully forward. I told Rachel it wasn't her business, that whatever was or wasn't happening next door had nothing to do with why she'd driven 2 hours to stand in my driveway. She smiled then, the exact smile I used to dread during our marriage, the one that meant she had something she was about to enjoy saying more than she should have. "Careful with that one," she said, tilting her head toward Elena's house. "She knew you before she ever moved in next door." Ask her about the art show 2 years ago sometime. See what she says." I felt something cold move through my chest, quick and unwelcome, the way you feel a draft before you find the open window. I told Rachel she didn't know what she was talking about, that she was just trying to plant something ugly because her own life had fallen apart, and she couldn't stand the idea of mine staying intact. But even as the words left my mouth, I heard how thin they sounded, because some part of me had already been collecting its own small, unexplained details for months, and Rachel's comment had just given all of them a shape. "I'm not making it up," Rachel said, reading the doubt on my face the way she always used to, before I'd even finished forming it myself. "A friend of mine was at that show, said there was a woman crying near one of the paintings, and some stranger stopped to help her. Small towns talk, Nathan. Word travels further than you'd think, even 2 years later." She said it almost lightly, like she was doing me a favor, but I knew her well enough to hear the satisfaction underneath it, the old habit of enjoying whatever leverage she could find, especially now, especially when her own life had come apart at the seams and mine so clearly had not. She left not long after that, unsatisfied that I wouldn't give her the reaction she came for, climbing back into her car with the same tight smile, saying something about how she hoped I'd figure it out before it was too late. I stood in the driveway long after her taillights disappeared around the corner, staring at the space where her car had been, and then, slower than I would like to admit, I turned and looked at Elena's house. I walked over that evening instead of waiting for one of our usual excuses. She opened the door already looking like she knew what I had come to ask, which somehow made it worse. I asked her straight out, no easing into it, whether she had known me before she moved in, whether there had been some art show 2 years ago that mattered. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer than that, stretched thin in the space between us. Her hands came together and gripped each other tightly, the way people hold on when they're bracing for something. She didn't answer right away, and that hesitation told me more than any words could have. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, and I heard my own voice come out colder than I meant it to, colder than I wanted it to be with her, but I couldn't seem to pull the edge back out of it. She looked up at me then, and I watched something break quietly behind her eyes. "Because I was afraid you'd look at me exactly the way you're looking at me right now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer for that. I stood there on her porch, the evening going gray and cool around us, the kitchen light behind her throwing a long shadow across the steps, and for the first time since she had knocked on my door with a leaking sink and a strange, careful question, I didn't know what to believe about the woman standing in front of me. Every warm evening we'd spent together over the past months seemed to shift slightly under the weight of that one unanswered question, like furniture rearranged in a room I thought I knew by heart. I told her I needed some time, and I walked back across the yard without looking back, though I could feel her watching me the whole way. I sat on my own porch step for a long while afterward, turning the wrench over in my hands without any real reason to hold it, just something familiar to keep my fingers busy while my mind circled back to her face, to the exact way it had fallen when I asked my question. I hated how much it hurt to walk away from something I still didn't fully understand. She came to my door the next evening, before I had worked up the nerve to go to hers. I opened it and found her standing there in the porch light, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, eyes red in a way that told me she had been crying for a while before she knocked. I stepped back to let her in, and we stood in my kitchen, neither of us quite ready to be the first one to speak. "You don't remember me," she finally said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "But I remember you." She told me about a night 2 years earlier, an art show in Charlotte where one of her paintings was being exhibited for the first time, a small, hopeful moment in a year that had otherwise been falling apart around her. Her marriage at the time had already been unraveling for months, quietly, the way these things do before anyone says the word out loud, and that show was supposed to be one bright thing to hold on to. Instead, a careless collector had knocked into the easel near the entrance, sent her painting crashing to the floor, and laughed about it before walking away without so much as an apology. I was standing there in front of everyone, and I felt like I was about to fall apart completely, she said. And then this stranger just knelt down, picked up my painting like it actually mattered, and told me it was beautiful. He didn't know my name. He didn't know anything about what was happening in my life that year. He just stopped for maybe 30 seconds, and treated something I'd made like it was worth something. I felt the floor shift slightly under me as she spoke, because I did remember that night, vaguely, the way you remember 100 small kindnesses you never expected to matter to anyone. I hadn't thought about it in 2 years. I certainly hadn't thought about it as the moment that would bring a woman across 2 states to move in next door to me. You don't know what that did for me, Elena went on, her hands twisting together the way they had the night before. I went home and I didn't leave my husband that night, or that month. But I started remembering that there were still people in the world who noticed things, who were kind without needing anything back for it. It took me another year to actually leave, but that 30 seconds stayed with me the entire time, like proof that not everyone was the way my marriage had made me believe people were. She told me the rest slowly, like she was setting down something heavy she had been carrying too long. How she had found out my name eventually, through a mutual acquaintance at the gallery. How she hadn't looked for me on purpose, not exactly, but how his name had stuck in the back of her mind the way certain names do. How, when her own divorce finalized, and she started looking for a fresh start somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the life that had worn her down, she saw a listing for a small house in this town and recognized the street name from something she'd overheard once, years earlier, about where I lived. She said she told herself it was a coincidence even as she signed the paperwork. She said some part of her had known better the whole time. I wasn't trying to trick you, she said, looking at me directly now, her eyes still wet but steadier than before. I just wanted to be near the kind of person who does that for a stranger and doesn't even remember it afterward. I told myself I'd never even have to bring it up. I just wanted to know you a little, from close by, and see if the man who did that was real in the rest of his life too. I stood there in my own kitchen, the wrench still sitting on the counter from earlier that evening, and I understood something I hadn't let myself see clearly until that moment. She hadn't come into my life because of who I was now, the quiet man fixing sinks and porch lights in a small town nobody outside of it had heard of. She had come because of one unremembered evening when I had simply been myself, without an audience, without a reason, and that version of me had apparently been enough to change the direction of someone's whole life. I reached out and took her hand, still cold from standing outside in the evening air, and I told her the truth, that I didn't remember the moment the way she did, that I couldn't give her back the memory she had built her hope around, but that it didn't change how real what was happening between us felt right now. In this kitchen, tonight, she let out a breath like she had been holding it for months, maybe longer, and something in her shoulders finally loosened. We didn't solve everything that night. There was still Rachel's ugly satisfaction to think about, still my own bruised pride to work through, still the strange fact of how we had arrived at this exact point in our lives. But standing there with her hand in mine, I knew I wasn't walking away from her. Whatever had brought Elena Marsh to the house next door, I found I wanted to know what came next for both of us, together, and that felt like the only decision that actually mattered. Outside, the wind picked up against the kitchen window, and somewhere down the street a dog barked twice and went quiet again. Ordinary sounds, the kind I had heard 1,000 nights before without thinking twice about them. But that night, they felt different, softer somehow, like the whole street had settled into something steadier now that the truth was finally sitting out in the open between us, instead of hidden underneath careful half-answers. I chose to forgive her that night, and more importantly, I chose to keep choosing it in the weeks that followed, because forgiveness, I learned, isn't a single decision you make once and never think about again. It's something you have to decide over and over, in small, ordinary moments, until eventually you stop noticing you're deciding it at all, until it simply becomes the shape of how you love someone. We rebuilt things slowly, the way you repair something valuable that's been dropped, careful with the cracks, patient with the pieces that don't quite fit back together the first time you try. I fixed the fence between our 2 yards properly that fall. Not the quick patch job I'd done back when we were still just neighbors, but a real repair. New posts sunk deep into the ground, because some part of me understood I wasn't building a boundary between our 2 properties anymore, so much as a bridge with a gate in it that we both had a key to. Elena started coming over on Sunday afternoons to cook, and I learned she was a far better cook than she ever let on during those early months of borrowed cabinet repairs and porch light fixes. We fell into an easy rhythm, her at the stove, me setting the table, the kitchen radio playing whatever old station she'd found, and decided she liked. Some evenings she brought her sketchbook and sat on my porch while I worked on some small project or another, and I stopped wondering what she was drawing, because eventually she just showed me, unprompted, no longer needing to close the book quickly when I got too close. One page, I remember, was a study of my hands wrapped around a wrench, done from memory, she told me, from that very first afternoon under her sink, long before either of us had said a true word about why she was really there. There were still hard days. Rachel called twice more in the months that followed, and both times I let it go to voicemail without a second thought, which told me something about how far I'd actually moved past that chapter of my life. Elena had her own hard days too, moments when the weight of what she'd done, moving her entire life to be near a man who didn't even remember the kindness that started it all, seemed to catch up with her all at once. On those nights, I didn't try to talk her out of the feeling. I just stayed close, fixed whatever needed fixing around her, and let time do the slow work that words never could. There was one evening in particular, close to the 7-month mark, when she sat on my porch steps and admitted quietly that she still sometimes worried I'd wake up one day and resent her for the strange way we'd started, for the fact that she'd chosen this life around me before I'd ever had the chance to choose it myself. I told her the truth, which was that I'd stopped thinking of it as strange months earlier. I told her that most good things in my life had arrived sideways, unannounced, never in the neat order I would have planned them in if anyone had asked me. My father's wrench had come to me the same way. An ordinary Tuesday turned permanent without any warning at all. She seemed to relax after that, like she'd needed permission to stop apologizing for something that had, in the end, brought both of us somewhere better than where we'd started. 10 months passed that way, quietly, the two of us circling closer without ever making a big announcement out of it. Then, on a cool morning in early summer, I helped her carry the last of her boxes across the yard and into my house, because somewhere in those 10 months, without either of us formally deciding it out loud, it had simply become obvious that we belonged under one roof instead of two. We never said the actual words, not in any dramatic way, not with flowers or a speech or a moment either of us had planned out in advance. We said it instead through the small accumulation of ordinary things. She started leaving a cup of black coffee, no sugar, on the counter every morning before I even made it downstairs, and I started fixing whatever needed fixing in her side of the house before she ever had to ask me twice. Love, I came to understand, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just quietly rearranges your habits until you can't remember what your life looked like without the other person's fingerprints all over it. That summer, I built her a proper easel out of oak, sanded smooth, sturdy enough to hold a canvas twice the size of anything she'd worked on before, and I set it up by the window in the room that got the best afternoon light. She cried when she saw it, which surprised her more than it surprised me, and she told me it was the first gift anyone had given her in years that wasn't trying to be something else underneath, wasn't trying to buy forgiveness or apologize for something or fix a problem it had caused. It was just a gift, given because I'd noticed what she needed and wanted her to have it. A few weeks after that, she gave me a small wooden box she'd made herself, carved and sanded by hand over what must have been dozens of quiet evenings I never noticed her working on it. Inside, lined with a soft cloth, was a space shaped exactly for my father's wrench. I stood there holding it, running my thumb along the grain of the wood, and I understood what she was telling me without either of us saying it out loud. She wasn't just keeping a tool safe from scratches in a drawer. She was telling me she understood what that wrench meant, what my father meant, what it meant to be the kind of man who keeps carrying something forward instead of letting it get lost in the noise of a life moving too fast to notice the small, important things. I placed the wrench in its new home that evening, on the shelf by the back door where I could see it every morning on my way out, and something about the sight of it settled a part of me that had been unsettled for longer than I had realized, maybe since before the divorce even, maybe for most of my adult life, a restlessness I had never quite found the name for until it finally went quiet. Elena stood beside me, her shoulder against mine, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. We didn't need to. The wrench sat exactly where it belonged, and so finally did we. Looking back now, I still think about how it all started, with nothing more than a leaking sink and a soft, trembling question I didn't understand the weight of at the time. I think about how easy it would have been to walk past a stranger at an art show 2 years earlier to keep moving, to never kneel down and pick up a fallen painting. I never would have known what that 30 seconds meant to someone. I never would have known it would eventually bring her to a house next door to mine, or that a wrench in a wooden box could end up meaning as much as it does now. I used to think I was just fixing a sink that afternoon. It turns out I was fixing a heart that had been broken for a long time, and somewhere along the way, without either of us planning it, that heart quietly started fixing mine right back. Neither of us saw it coming, and maybe that's exactly why it worked. So I'll ask you what I've been asking myself ever since. Have you ever done something small and kind, not even thinking twice about it, that ended up changing the whole direction of someone else's life without you ever knowing? And if that person came back one day, found their way to you again, would you have the courage to open your heart to them a second time? If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and leave a comment telling me whether you believe kindness like that can really bring two strangers together the way it brought Elena and me together. I'd genuinely love to hear what you think.